Now, do you think you're conscious? Because on the right-hand side, we have someone who thinks that he's a robot, and on your left-hand side, we have someone who knows, she's telling me that I wasn't to say things, who knows that she has no free will. And they're going to present you with some challenging ideas about the nature of consciousness and about robots. Now, the way we're going to organise this is, in a minute I'm going to hand over to Sue, who's going to introduce some ideas for you, put some challenging ideas forward. She's then going to turn over to Kevin, who will present some ideas he's published on extensively. Sue will then address some more ideas, and then it will come back to me, and I'll open the discussion up for members of the audience. We have a roving microphone which we can pass around, because you'll need a microphone to be able to hear each other speak, and we're going to take many comments or questions from the audience after they're spoken. So I'm now going to hand over to Sue to introduce this challenging topic.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me consciously? Hands up who's conscious. Fine. Hands up who's not conscious. Excellent. Hang on, any more? We got one more. Any more not conscious? Three plus Kevin. Four. Okay, 4 plus Kevin. You're in good company. And hands up who didn't put their hand up. Sissy with drips. Don't even know if you're conscious, huh? There were not very many of you didn't put your hand up. This question tells me at least 2 things. Doesn't tell me whether you're conscious or not, because I haven't a clue what that means, as we will discover as we go along. But what it does tell me is that hardly any of you refuse to answer on the grounds that you don't know what I mean. Consciousness seems to most of us to be just one of those obvious things. I wake up in the morning and I think, ooh, I was asleep, now I'm conscious. But it isn't that simple. I think that this tells us something very interesting, because hardly anyone says they're not conscious unless they've really, really thought about it, like Kevin, or perhaps some very long-term deep meditators who've been practicing for 13, 14, 15 years, who will give up the illusion of consciousness. But for most people it seems obvious. So that it may seem quite strange to learn that amongst scientists and neuroscientists and psychologists and philosophers, there is no definition of consciousness. No one has agreed on what we mean. The closest we seem to come in the field of consciousness studies, there is a name for it now, consciousness studies, because it's so multidisciplinary. There is a sort of agreement that we could go back to a famous paper in 1974 by Thomas Nagel. And the title of that paper was, a wonderful question, I think there's lots of questions and no answers, the wonderful question, what is it like to be a bat? What do you think it's like to be a bat? Could I have a bat, please? Would somebody like to be a bat? Anyone volunteer? Oh, come on. Somebody must want to be a bat. You can be a bat, can you? Okay, come on. What's your name? Kishan. Okay, Kishan, I want you to pretend to be a bat, please. Good. I think you're the wrong way up. Okay, anything else you're going to do apart from flap? A bit of supersonic squeaking? Squeaking? You can pretend. He's doing it. If anyone can. Okay. Thank you very much. So, we have a terrific background. You see the difficulty, Nagel chose something that is difficult. But, one point he made was, I've forgotten your name already, Kishan. If Kishan is pretending to be a bat, he's still got, you know, human language and so on, and memory. It doesn't count, it's not being a bat. But if he really became a bat, he would lose any ability to ask the question. So it's impossible. Now that's one odd thing about consciousness. But what really this paper left behind is this idea, and I'm sure you'll hear this through both our ways of talking quite a lot. If there's something it's like to be the bat, that's what we mean by it being conscious. And if there's nothing it's like to be the bat, that's what we mean by not being conscious. Does that make sense? Mm. So the closest we get to what we mean is what it's like for you. Okay, would you just be conscious a moment now? Okay, that's what we mean. What it's like for you at that moment. So, is there anything it's like to be this bottle? Shout your answers.
No.
No, you all agree about that. Is there something it's like to be a frog?
Yeah.
Some yeses and some no's. A baby?
Yes.
Oh, lots of yeses and maybe some no's. A human being, like, sorry, that's unkind, isn't it? But you get the idea. So this is kind of the closest we get to a definition, that it's something to do with what it's like to be me looking at this floor. So this is one of the peculiarities about consciousness. Now, I really want to get to what is the really big problem before I hand over to Kevin, which is this. If we talk about what it's like to be you having some experience, let's say, ta-da! Can you see that red? Mm-hmm. Yes? Can you all see that red? Yes. Okay, you're conscious of a red impression. Now, what's it like for you? Well, I don't know. Anyone colourblind here? Great, some men. It's usually men. Your colour system will be quite different from mine, so it's even harder. But even the rest of you, it's very hard, because there are slight differences in everybody's colour vision system. And there may even be some women here with tetrachromatic. In other words, they've got 4 primary colours. And then it's totally impossible for me to imagine. But even if it was, I was imagining, I wouldn't know whether it was the same. Another of the weird problems about consciousness. But if we're talking about this subjective experience, what the philosophers would call qualia, that is the redness of the red, the smell of the coffee, the feeling of what it's like. Scratch your head. Feel that feeling. Now that's a feeling that you're having, a subjective feeling of how your hair feels. How on earth can those subjective feelings come about in a world full of material objects? This is the old mind-body problem that's been around for thousands of years. In its modern incarnation, ever since we scientists were allowed to talk about consciousness, which has been less than 20 years, but whoopee, we are now, it's been called the hard problem of consciousness. That term was coined kind of accidentally by a then young philosopher called Dave Chalmers. And he defines the hard problem of consciousness as to understand how subjective experiences can arise from the objective goings-on in the brain. How mind can arise from matter, if you like, but more specifically how the redness of red comes about when we know so much about the colour visual system. I mean, we can look, at where all the information's going, but how can little electrical things in the brain be this? Is your head beginning to hurt? Good, good. I mean, if you're just sitting there going, then either, you're mystical, you've had such mystical experiences of oneness, or you're enlightened, or you've been meditating for 50 years, or you just can't be bothered to think about it. Because it really is a deep, difficult problem. Many people say the greatest mystery that science has to face now. Up there with, where do we all come from and why, and all those big questions. So, this is the hard problem. Now, the conventional way of going about the hard problem, which most scientists in consciousness studies are doing, is they're looking for the neural correlates of consciousness. They're looking for those bits in the brain that do the trick. Or that process, or that area, or that bit, or that whatever, conglomerate, neural coalition, whatever it might be they're looking for, that's going to be the magic thing that produces or gives rise to consciousness. I think that is, think of a polite word, twaddle. I think that's just saying, well, as long as we find where the magic's coming from, it doesn't matter that it's still magic. I think that Kevin and I are among the very few people who think that that's complete twaddle. And so you have, I'm delighted to say, invited whoever is responsible, they've invited here 2 of the kind of outcasts from consciousness studies who say that that conventional way is never going to work because consciousness is not what it seems to be. In my view, it's all a huge illusion, which I might come back to later, but you are going to hear Kevin's view. Now, heads hurting? If Kevin does his job properly, I think your heads will hurt even more, giving us a great deal of fun, and so I'm delighted to be able to hand you and your hurting heads over to Kevin O'Regan.
So, thank you very much, Susan, for this exciting introduction. Let me start, well, I'm going to talk first about the limits of conscious awareness, and then very quickly get on to how I try to solve this hard problem of consciousness, which probably many of you will not have seen. It's the dotted line in the road that's becoming, even though it's in a full view, again, you think you see the whole picture, and yet these kind of change blindness demonstrations show you don't. Here's another example. It's the tree at the back. So change blindness is a big literature. Actually, Susan Blackmore was one of the first people to invent the phenomenon. Here, Susan Blackmore, 1995 paper. But what I've shown you is examples of gradual changes, mud splashes, but it can also be done using flicker, eye saccades, blinks, using flicker. Oops. So this is quite a different picture from that one. Very big change. It's the reflection in the lake. And here is a wonderful example of Dan Simons. In real life, this is a video taken on the university campus. Dan Simons comes up to someone, asks them where the library is. And the man starts telling him where the library is. And now magically, Dan Simons is going to be replaced by Dan Levin right in front of the man's eyes. And the man is just going to go on talking to him as though nothing had happened. So, my interim conclusion up to now, seeing is not registering all the pixels in a scene. It's classifying, categorizing, noting aspects you are interested in. Because of our scarce attentional resources, we can't see everything. We only see what we're currently interested in categorizing. Nevertheless, we have this impression of seeing everything. And the reason for that is because anything we want to see, we can see it immediately by attending to it. And this immediate availability gives us the impression of presence. So this visual transience provide the impression of having tabs on it. And this is, this is how far my research had gone up to about 10 years ago. And I discovered these phenomena. And then I realized that the argument that I had been using to understand vision could be applied to consciousness in general. And that's the subject of my book, which is called Why Red Doesn't Sound Like Red. Asking really the question, why red feels red rather than green, for example, or why it doesn't sound like a bird. And if you go back to the structure of the argument that I've been using to explain vision, remember that I had two components to understand vision. One is an attentional component, which gives us conscious access to information. And one is the fact that the visual system has this grabbiness, which provides the richness and the illusion of richness and continuity and visual presence. It provides the experienced quality of vision. It's one factor that provides that quality. So let's see whether this idea, this structure of the argument can be used to understand other sensations, the 5 classic sensations. So in addition to seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. So the idea would be then that we have a 2-tiered kind of theory. Attending, cognitively accessing something that you are engaged in doing. When you're seeing, you're engaged in probing the outside world, getting information, analyzing what's going on, using your eye movements to extract information. So when you feel, for example, the softness of a sponge, the feel of the softness is something which you do. You are engaged in squishing the sponge, and that engagement has certain qualities. It obeys certain laws, and what it is like of softness lies in the fact that you are engaged in squishing the sponge in that particular way. And that is what you mean when you say that there's something that's like to the softness of the sponge, and it describes what that experience is like. And furthermore, you have your cognitive processes that are attending to the fact that you are so engaged. And those two things combined constitute what I would say you mean when you say that you're conscious of the softness of the sponge. So that's the theory that I try and create in my book. I don't really have time to go into the detail, but I've been able to apply that theory to color and quite successfully shown certain phenomena in color perception which neurophysiologists and psychophysicists of color have not been able to explain so far. So it's really a scientific approach, taking the idea that what we mean by the redness of red lies in the interaction that we have with red things when we move around and when red things are moved around in the environment under different planets. So red, under this theory, the redness of red is the way red things change to life. So that really is, you'll have to go and read my book, this is an advertisement. Sorry, don't have time to go on into more details, but this, I think, provides a complete theory of the so-called hard problem of consciousness. You need, what I'm saying is that you need to attend or cognitively access something that you're doing, and that what it is like of what you're doing, the experience quality, lies in the laws that govern that activity. However, there's a slight problem, and this is where I hand over to Susan. Who is experiencing?
Some of this idea, it is really profound what he's saying. Our natural intuition is something like this. There's a world out there, I'm in here, and I'm looking at it. I am seeing the red. And the reason that's happening, we kind of think, is because there is a conscious being, and there's some kind of picture in the head, a mental image, something like that, that is being experienced. Kevin is saying that is not so. The brain, the whole body in this world is doing something, and that's all there is to it. Now, on the one side, he said, well, seeing red is doing something about relating to the coloured information in the world, rather than building up a picture that's red. And he's then thrown it over to me to say, but who's doing it? Well, right, who is doing it? Just look at this red, and then who's looking? You see, if you think about the way the brain is constructed, there cannot be somebody in there. I mean, unless you don't believe in a soul or something like, like that. But there are trillions of neurons joined together in constantly changing coalitions in trillions of different ways, all change all the time. There's no middle. There's no place. We know very much where all the colour information goes. It doesn't all come together on some kind of mental screen inside the brain that some other bit of the brain could look at, and that be the redness of red. No. And I mean, I would have said that from, ages and ages. It's just what it's like, when you look at how the brain works. But what Helen is adding to this is that the system is doing something, and it's the doing of noticing the way the red changes, predicting what's going to happen when you move your head, etc., that makes the redness of red. And there's nobody having that experience. You build up this illusion of somebody in there out of all the things that are going on. Well, I would love to go on for ages. Michael won't let me, but I hope that's a gist of the kind of things that each of us is trying to do with this fantastic mystery. And now it's over to you to ask some really difficult questions to serve us right.
Is it experience? You mentioned about, are you a child or a baby? Do they have, as one gets older, an experience of the world, and so consequently the brain is able to pick up images or whatever it is from its past to make a picture of what it sees now, if I've expressed myself? Does it build up over age?
Well, my answer would be, I can't give you the answer. My answer would be, something is definitely building up. All through your life, the brain is changing, it's getting more used to doing things. In Kevin's terms, it's building up sensory motor understandings of the relationship between what it does and what happens when it does it. All that is being built up. But neither of us, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, would say that it ever builds up a picture. You see, it's really, really difficult to grab this, but I think this is the way to think about it. I look over there, meaning this body turns its head and the eyes point over there, and it kind of feels as though there's a picture in my head of that projector, or there's a projector out there that I'm seeing. Actually, if Kevin's right, what's going on is, I look at that, oh, there's a corner there, and I think, oh, the word projector comes to mind, and so on. But they're always just little scraps. That's all there ever is, little scraps. And why am I deluded into thinking I'm seeing the whole projector? Because that little scrap makes me think, well, if it's a projector, it'll have another corner over there. My eyes shift over there, there's another corner. Now that one's gone away, and that one's come, and now I think, oh, there must be a light. Oh, there's a light. And I can never catch myself out not seeing the thing that I'm not looking at, if you see what I mean. So that's how I get deluded. Do you want to have a go at that?
It's a bit like the light in the refrigerator. You open the fridge, and the light looks like it's on, and you close the fridge, and you say, so why don't you sneak open the door and it's still on, so it looks like it's on all the time, and then you know it's not on all the time. In the same way, the world outside for us seems like it's continually present all the time, but in fact it's just an illusion created by the fact that at the slightest flick of our attention or our eyelid, information is available. So there's no picture in our head. The picture out in the world is sufficient.
I must say, ever since I went to a lecture by Kevin, yonks ago, and he said that about the fridge, I've felt ever since then that I'm constantly going around the world trying to catch myself out. What was I conscious of a moment ago? No, I could never do it. I could never use the light to see into the darkness, as William James said in 1890. He said introspection into these questions like consciousness is like trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness works.
We've got another question from the front.
So, Kevin, why are you a robot?
Well, I didn't really have time to go into the answer to the question of who am I, but I think I agree with the philosopher Dan Dennett that I am a story that this brain and body is telling about myself. And I think social psychologists agree that the self is not a single thing, it's a construct that we construct. We justify how we go about doing the things that we do. And I think there's nothing magical about the notion of the self. I think it is just such a story. So I think such stories could be invented by robots if they interact in a society of other robots and have friends and relations and have things to talk about and want to be able to justify what they would then call their motives, their beliefs, their desires. These are all just constructs, memes, as Susan Blackmore has eloquently suggested also. So that's why I handed over to her. I thought she was going to talk about the self as a meme.
I would have if Michael hadn't told me I'd only got 2 minutes.
Can you actually explain? I don't think everyone in the audience knows. Also, perhaps explain why you think you have no...
Oh, God, right, I've got 10 minutes. Meme is any information that's copied from person to person. The real significance of this, in my mind, is that almost every other species doesn't imitate. Whales do a little bit, elephants do a little bit, chimpanzees very poorly, but basically it's a human phenomenon. So by copying information, stories, ideas, behaviours, driving on the left, eating with a knife and fork, whatever it is, all having lectures, all these things are copied from person to person, they evolve, and culture is, in my mind, another evolving system. Memes are the replicators in culture, the same way genes are the replicators in biology. But the significance of this to the self is that each of us, through our lives, is picking up memes from a very, very early age, as soon as we can start imitating as an infant. And a lot of those memes are to do with self. Very early on, to begin with, we say mummy, but then we get me, I, and around that notion of self, or that word of self, accrete all these other memes. And it's a big advantage to certain memes to have I joined on. I believe in God. I want to, whatever it might be. It gives a kind of boundary, it makes like an organism, really. A virtual organism or an informational organism, which the self then becomes, sustained by this information processing system. So I would say that the self is a memeplexx, a long-lasting complex of memes that each person builds up through their lifetime. But I would like to say something else about the self as well. If you think of it that way, you could think of it as something continuous, and you might still feel, well, okay, it's a memeplexx, but it carries on in my brain, and it goes on, and that's the thing that's conscious. But I would deny that. I think when you wake up in the morning, you just assume, oh, it's the same me as yesterday. But it isn't. It's a different one. But more interestingly than that, and this comes partly from my 30 years of Zen practice and meditating every day and stuff like that, and paying attention mindfully. It's a new one, you know, it's when I hang on to it, being mindful, I hang on to this same self and think it's continuous, and then I learn something else, and then, oh, another one comes along, oh, and I think this is the same me that's been all the time. I had a nice experience, which I really enjoyed just before the lecture. I was asking people, are you conscious, are you conscious? And this woman came up and I said, are you conscious? And I just grabbed her at that moment, and I could just see her go. And that kind of feeling of suddenly becoming conscious because somebody's asked you about yourself, or in your ordinary life, becoming conscious because suddenly something you think, oh, where am I? What's this about? And that's fine. That's true. But what's not true is that that was the same self as a moment ago, or this morning, or yesterday. Selves, in my opinion, are just ephemeral constructs. They hang on to the stories from the past, but then they use different stories every time they appear, or slightly different stories. So selves are just ephemeral, fleeting things. So the whole idea that I am sitting here experiencing the red and it was the same me that walked into this lecture theatre half an hour ago, that is all just a convenient story that helps us get by. But it's not the truth. And that's why I go around saying, well, I live without free will. I actively, if ever the illusion comes up again, I'll just get something in here will go, oh, that's that free will illusion, just drop it. There isn't a me making the decisions. The whole universe, this body in this world, is making the decisions, and it will make them whether I have an illusion of self or not. I don't know whether Kevin's robot, living as a robot, is like that, but it is quite possible, I would say, to dismantle these things and not be dragged back into them. That's quite tricky to do. That was a bit of a ramble, but I was going to answer 3 questions at once.
Good. We've got one question over here.
Oh, John, we've got...
Yes. Over here.
Okay.
Yes, just take
hello. Mine's kind of a double-barrel question. One, why have we evolved to delude ourselves into thinking that we are agents of free will, etc., etc., etc. then? And secondly, in your mind, no pun intended, is there absolutely no place at the borders of our understanding and discovery in science in the future to understand consciousness as some sort of very, very, very subtle substance, which sounds like a mystical twaddle like the soul or the ether, but a very subtle substance which comes into the mind and works in the apparatus of the mind, but isn't generated by the mind. Some sort of, magnetic force type principle. I was just wondering what your opinion on that would be.
Okay, I'm going to ask both speakers to address those questions. I'm going to start with Kevin, and then I'm going to turn to Stuart. Kevin first, please.
What was the first question then? Why we evolved? Yes, I don't like that at all. Why is life evolved? Why is the universe the way it is? In order to explain these things, we always have some kind of a posteriori justification. But I think it's just the way that things are. I don't think we need to give a reason for why consciousness exists. And I think it's a terrible error to go looking for the function of consciousness. A lot of people think consciousness has a purpose. I think consciousness has no purpose. It's a word that describes the way we interact with our environments. Asking whether consciousness has a purpose, why it has evolved, is to make a mistake. And it's to make the same mistake as to ask the question, why has life evolved? It's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. There is no answer to that question. So I think there's no answer to that. The second question, do we think that there's something extra in our biological brains which gives rise to consciousness? Well, there may be, but I think that it's not necessary at present, from a scientific point of view, to appeal to any extra mechanism of that kind in order to explain the way we are and the way we feel. Up until recently, people have been looking for this neural correlate of consciousness in somewhat the same way as the vitalists at the beginning of the 20th century were looking for the biological correlate of life, and they proposed some kind of vital spirit or élan vital that was generating life. And I think that was a mistake, as modern biology has now shown. We can explain virtually everything about life in terms of simple mechanistic chemical processes. It's true we perhaps can't explain the poetry of life, but science has really evolved, has really advanced significantly by abandoning this, what would be called reification of life, the idea that life is a thing, some kind of élan in biological systems. And I think the same tag can be used to solve the hard problem of consciousness. You take the tag that consciousness is not a thing being generated by our brains, it is rather just a word that describes the way we interact with our environment. So it's a sort of, it's the wrong question to look in the brain for something generating consciousness.
The second part, I completely agree with Kevin, totally. Yeah, of course you might find such a thing. What's really exciting is working out why we don't need such a thing, because it would be pretty magical. But if they find it great, I mean, I spent 20 years and 25 years of my research life as a parapsychologist looking for paranormal phenomena, because I really thought that that would explain all these mysteries. Well, it doesn't. I never found any, and that's a waste. Well, it wasn't a waste of time, really. I learned a lot, but it's not the way I want to spend any more of my time. But the first one, I would say, my answer is very different. I think it is an interesting question, at least if your question was to do with why we're so deluded, why does the illusion come about? Why do we all go around thinking there's somebody in here looking out through the eyes, thinking that this thing is the thing that is conscious and has free will? There are many possibilities. I think it's a very difficult question. Dan Dennett, whom Kevin has already mentioned, asks and hasn't really answered that question. My answer, which I wrote in the Mean Machine, is that it's to the advantage of the means, and I mentioned that earlier. They form this kind of cluster. It's to their advantage, not ours, in the same way that there are many things that are to the advantage of our genes, but not us as individual people. But I think there are lots of ways one could look for that, to try and find out why we fall into these delusions, because that might help us to throw them off. And then you get to an even more difficult question. Well, actually, is it better to throw them off? Because many people would say, you know, well, you can't go around living without free will. You couldn't function. Well, actually, I seem to be functioning okay. But, you know, it'd be dangerous. Oh, the whole legal system would fall apart. And if we, you know, didn't have an illusion of self, how would we get up in the morning? Well, just kind of do. But a lot of questions hang around that one, and I do think it's quite interesting, and I can't give you a definitive answer.
Good. Have you got a question over here? Yes, please.
So, one of the issues of consciousness is that it's often used to inform questions of rights, particularly in non-human beings. We say, okay. So, one of the issues of consciousness is that it's often used to inform questions of rights, particularly in non-human beings. We say, okay, we think dolphins are pretty conscious, so we won't use them for fish food. We think people are really conscious, so we will treat them with absolute respect, etc., etc. Your model for consciousness is based on two factors: sense organs, or some sort of recording structure, and duration. So it's the notion that something over time drags in sensoria, and then they persist, and it builds up a narrative structure from it. That's so obviously not restricted to purely humans, and possibly not even purely animals. I just wonder if you could sort of explore that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I think. I think that the notion of consciousness can be applied to anything. I agree with you entirely, and my point of view indeed poses very deep ethical problems, because essentially, if this is what we mean by consciousness, if consciousness is attending to some interaction I'm having with the world, if that's what we as adults mean when we say I'm conscious of this red piece of paper, then we cannot say that children, babies, a newborn baby is conscious in the same way. If the newborn baby is conscious, then it's conscious in some completely different way. This definition does not apply, because the baby doesn't even have sufficient cognitive capacity to attend to what he's doing, and he doesn't have a self to do it. So the baby is sort of just a biological machine going about doing things. Now when you pinch the baby and the baby cries, I would claim the baby is just manifesting a reaction to what you do to it. It is not feeling pain in anything like the way we feel pain. That is not to say that what you do to the baby is not harming it. It's been shown, for example, that if you do circumcision on babies without anesthetic, they tend to have higher chance of having personality disorders in adolescence. So the baby's interaction with the world and the stress that's created by the lack of anesthetic at that time affects its future development. But that doesn't mean that the baby felt the pain in any way like how we feel pain. So I think it's very interesting, because this approach means that we have to take our own responsibilities to towards these ethical questions. We have to decide, yes, these animals, we're going to eat them. These animals, we're going to be able to do experiments on them, but not on the basis of some pseudo-scientific notion of consciousness. Because consciousness is just a word, it's a definition, and we can decide to apply it to thermostats or to refrigerators. There is no matter of fact about it. There is no scientific issue. It's a definitional issue. And that means that we as humans have to take greater responsibility in deciding who we are going to allow, who we're going to eat, how we're going to behave to other individuals. And these are social questions. 50 years ago, doctors operated on babies without anesthetic because they thought that babies did not feel pain. And that might shock you today. And it just shows that it is a social decision in our society to think whether or not someone else is in pain or not. In fact, my view on pain is that my pain is not in me. My pain comes from you. I look at you, looking at me, and you say, what's happening to him is a bad thing. So I look at you and I say, oh, what's happening to me must be a bad thing. And that makes me really feel the pain. And it's the same with the notion of I. I only exist by virtue of you. I think children learn the notion of self only by looking at their families and friends moving around and making the deduction that in order to describe the behavior of these entities moving around, it's good to postulate the notion of a self with motives and desires and beliefs. And then having done that on others, it realizes, I myself are like them. And that is the birth of the notion of the self.
I won't add anything. I think that's a brilliant answer.
We've got one point or question from... Yes, please.
Hi, sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so sorry if I cough through this. Okay, I'm a scientist, and obviously... Hi, sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so sorry if I cough through this. Okay, I'm a scientist, and obviously that means that I predominantly have beliefs based on fact. I'm not going to go down the religion pathway because that's a whole different talk altogether. But I'm wondering whether or not there are any psychologists that are more strongly on the scientific front in the sense that, for example, the model of if a tree falls, is it heard? In my eyes, yes, it makes a noise, and that noise and how it's perceived by us is obviously subjective, which comes back to what Sue was saying. Perception is a subjective thing, but then coming back to what you were saying, it is based on your neurons and your nerves, etc. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is there that combination of the two ideologies where we are subject to our composition, and that's the thing that varies. That what's around us is always there. It doesn't change, and it only changes because of us individually, our perceptions. Sorry if that didn't come out very well.
In a kind of way, you're asking an impossible philosophical question. What is it really? What is the world really? What is this stuff? And of course, these kind of deep questions are really interesting. I want to go right back to the mind-body problem. It seems that there are subjective phenomena and objective phenomena. I didn't say there are. I said, I hope I didn't. There seem to be. It seems as though the redness of red, I've never done this before, it's quite fun. The redness of red is a subjective phenomenon, and whatever it is causing the red is a real objective phenomenon. Now, the sound of the tree falling is very analogous to the red, so we'll stick with the red since we're on about that, and Kevin's book is all about red. Redness is a phenomenon arising from the relationship between a visual system of any particular animal that has colour vision and the energy in the light falling on its visual system. And the concept of red simply does not apply in a world without animals looking at things. And I would not say that there's the red, and then the light comes into your brain, and then it goes into your eyes, and then it goes into your brain, and then da-da, there's a consciousness of red. I would say there's a whole process between the two and that constitute them. But again and again, we go back into this dichotomy between subjective and objective. And I would say almost every single living philosopher and scientist who's thought about these things rejects dualism, particularly in its Cartesian form. In other words, there's a mind and there's a body, and they sort of connect somehow. Simply because the connection doesn't, whatever you try and make of the connection, it doesn't work. As Dennett says, dualism is forlorn. But dualism constantly creeps back into all our thinking. And when people talk about the neural correlates of consciousness, they're talking about there's consciousness on the one side, and then there's its neural correlates on the objective side. And again, and you read any textbook on psychology that brings in, like a first year textbook, brings in consciousness, there'll always be, and there are conscious processes in the brain and unconscious processes in the brain, which is just, back into dualism. So it constantly besets us. I went to a wonderful conference, bit batty, but wonderful conference in the Netherlands this summer called Science and Non-Duality. And I thought, yes, these are all kind of non-religious people battling with this thing. How can we appreciate the world as one rather than constantly dividing it up into subjective and objective? That doesn't really answer your question, but I hope it got at the kind of things that were driving you to ask that question. Did it?
Yeah, that was great, thanks.
Well, we started 10 minutes late, so we're going to just keep going for just one more question. So we've got time for one more question. We've got a lady over there who's over there, yes?
Hello. I used to think that the fact that my perception of red yesterday was the same as it is today showed that I had a consistent consciousness. But recently, upon discovering that I had Asperger's syndrome, I realised that I only process 50% of everything I see and everything I hear, just because of who I am. Does that mean that I can have a very high IQ and still only be semi-conscious?
Do you want Kevin to answer that one first?
I have a very high IQ, but I'm not conscious at all.
Sue, do you want to add something to that?
I don't understand at all what you meant about only processing 50% of... Can you explain what you meant by that?
I've only just recently discovered that I only hear half of every sentence people say to me and only see about half of the data I take in.
But you've just watched this fantastic lecture, albeit condensed and briefly. Nobody sees anything like 50% of what they're looking at. I mean, you can't measure percentages, but if you could, something like, 1%, 0.5% of it. I mean, I'm looking at this room now and getting the impression that I see all of you. All of these demonstrations that Kevin's done, and I started back in 1995 with this very simple change blindness demo where I just moved the picture like when you move your eyes. Every time I move my eyes, the whole lot's kind of gone away, except for maybe a vague gist that I'm in a room with all you people, and I wouldn't notice if all of you changed. If someone's told you something completely bonkers based on the idea that we all look at the world and see it all. We don't. You're just like the rest of us, only we're all a bit different.
So it just leaves me to thank Professor Blackmore and Professor O'Regan for an absolutely fascinating and challenging talk, and to thank you, the audience, for your questions and your comments, and for being such a super audience. So thank you very much, and good night.